subjugated.
So, Auntie Esther, are you suggesting there's a risk in creating these two-tiered and multi-tiered systems of healing, in terms of those that actually get access to these resources and the majority of African people that don't?
Yes, and this connects directly to what we discussed in episode 4, our last episode, about movement capture. When healing is commodified and accessible primarily to privileged participants who can afford international travel or who are selected by some criteria that we don't know, it becomes another form of elite capture that separates reparations discourse from the lived realities of most African people. And that's who we always need to centre. It is the masses, it's not ourselves. Even as activists, there are different types of elitism that can occur within activist spaces, believe it or not. And I'm very conscious of that and always try and work against that as much as possible by grounding myself back into community and thinking about who's not present. What would they say if they were here in this room?
Okay. Now, I understand that one of the outcomes was addressing the complicity question, exploring to what extent Africans were complicit in the European trafficking of Africans. How did you view the summit's conclusion that the trafficking of Africans was not conceived or led by Africans, neither did they benefit from it?
I actually agree with the Accra Summit's conclusion on this matter. One of the most important contributions that we heard at the summit was a dynamic presentation by Xosei Nafafe, Associate Professor of African and Atlantic History, who teaches at the University of Bristol, who I met for the first time at this summit, and whose groundbreaking research fundamentally challenges the simplified African complicity narrative. His work on Lourenço da Silva Mendonça, a member of the Ndongo royal family, who brought a legal case against Atlantic slavery to the Vatican in 1684, provides compelling evidence that the transatlantic trafficking of enslaved Africans was indeed a brutal, profit-driven system orchestrated by European powers. And he's not the only one, but it's a really important book that he's published. And actually the book is called Lourenço da Silva Mendonça and the Black Atlantic Abolitionist Movement in the 17th Century. It was published in 2022. But in Professor Xosei's presentation, he emphasized that the Africans that were complicit were conquered Africans. Yeah? That we had been subjugated, we had been conquered. And his work uncovers how Portuguese authorities in Angola imposed what's called the baculamento system in 1626, which was a tax payment requiring local rulers to deliver enslaved people annually. So they were subjugated peoples, even though they would have been in rulership. So this system, this tax system, which has largely been overlooked by historians, transformed local social and political structures, forcing African rulers who had been conquered by the Portuguese forces to participate in capturing people, rather than existing African sort of systems of peonage or what would be called domestic servitude. It was thus imposed as a colonial taxation that drove much of what has been mistakenly interpreted as, oh, they sold us out, i.e. African complicity.
That's fascinating research and history that you've shared there. And it really does challenge the entire foundation of the complicity narrative.
Exactly. And while I and many others recognize the nuances of historical dynamics and the diverse African responses to European, conquest and incursion, from resistance to different degrees of accommodation, to different types of kind of tactical engagements, Professor Xosei's research strengthens rather than undermines the core truth of European responsibility for the systematic trafficking of Africans. And his work on Mendonca's Vatican case demonstrates that Africans themselves were actively challenging chattel enslavement, its legality and morality. Yeah, they were actively challenging that. They resisted that. So it's a very simplified narrative that says, oh, they sold us out, without looking at the brutal conquest and genocide that our people were facing, and literally how many of them were forced into survival strategies, including being forced to wage war on neighboring kingdoms and societies.
Great. Now, I've been led to understand that the summit also emphasized the need for African-centered models of healing drawn from indigenous wisdom. Now, how do you, or even we, access them?
That's a really important question, Simeon, and definitely African-centered models of healing drawn from indigenous wisdom holds huge potential. But the question of access is a really vital question, because once again, are we in danger of creating models of healing in a system of racial capitalism and taken outside of our community context, where people are selling these services because they know that we are in need? And so we must be vigilant about the risk of traditional African healing practices being extracted, decontextualized, and commodified. When indigenous knowledge systems are integrated into Eurocentric professionalized frameworks without addressing the socio-economic, political, and cultural structures that create ongoing trauma, we see a form of spiritual bypassing that treats symptoms while leaving root causes intact. I'm reminded here by the revolutionary psychiatrist Papa Frantz Fanon, who basically taught us that it is in struggle that people heal, renew, and empower themselves, by destroying the conditions of their disorientation and their subjugation and oppression. So true healing, especially for us as a people, requires not only psychological and emotional well-being, but fundamentally a stopping of the maangamizi, a dismantling of the systems of oppression or downpression that contribute to psychological, social, cultural, political, spiritual harm. This liberation process involves cultural revolution, reclaiming and reconstructing African culture, and engaging in a transformative struggle for socio-political, economic, and cultural change.
Now, am I right in understanding that the summit called for African heads of state, global civil society, and people of African descent everywhere to align behind a continental and global agenda for healing anchored in justice, unity, and historical truth? How might this alignment work in practice, given the power differentiators that exist between these groups?
That's a crucial question. For such alignment to be meaningful, We need clear accountability mechanisms to ensure that community voices are not overshadowed by state or institutional agendas. True healing cannot occur within structures that reproduce hierarchies of voice and power, whether between states and communities or between privileged and marginalized groups within our movements.
So you're suggesting that the healing discourse, while important, must be grounded in material realities and accessible to those most impacted by the historical and ongoing harms.
Absolutely. A liberatory approach would begin by acknowledging that true healing cannot be separated from material conditions. It would prioritize economic justice alongside spiritual reconnection. It would be accessible to all, not just those with resources to attend international summits or who can be resourced to attend such summits. And crucially, it would connect individual healing to collective liberation by addressing the ongoing structural violence of global racial capitalism rather than treating trauma as merely a historical legacy. And at this point, I'd like to invite our listeners to reflect on how healing initiatives in their own communities might either challenge or reinforce these very contradictions. How can we develop approaches to healing that do not separate spiritual restoration from economic justice or individual recovery from collective liberation?
Let's turn now to the London Dialogue on Pan-Africanism that took place this month. This historic gathering was organised around the theme of the London Conference 125 years later, Pan-Africanism and a Dialogue on Reparations, marking 125 years since the first Pan-African Conference in London. I understand you played a significant role in this event.
Yes, I was also part of the drafting committee that produced the London Pan-African Declaration, working alongside Dr. Beryl Beekman and Professor Gus John to craft what we consider to be a landmark declaration in contemporary Pan-African organising. And we formally presented the declaration draft to Professor Robert Xosei, Togo's Minister of Foreign Affairs, on April the 9th, which is when the London conference took place.
That's a tremendous contribution. Yet from media coverage, one might not even know about your involvement.
That's precisely the point I want to highlight. So while the conference itself wasn't characterized by outright conflict, it did reveal deep tensions regarding who shapes Pan-African narratives and whose contributions are recognized. So although women like myself and Sister Dr. Beryl Beekman and Sister Christelle played leading roles in the intellectual development and organizing of the conference, including drafting the conference declaration, media coverage primarily focused on the man of the moment, and that is Professor Xosei, probably because of who he is. He is the Minister of Foreign Affairs for the government of Togo, who will be hosting the 9th Pan-African Congress in December in Togo, that this London conference was, if you like, a lead up to. And so most of the media focused on his comments, his speech. And that was unfortunate that many of those who came around and were reporting only seemed to be interested in what the minister was saying, rather than also paying attention to the discussions that were coming from the two panels. There was the first panel on Pan-Africanism and its history, and the second panel was on reparations. and also the comments and contributions and discussion points that came from those who were in attendance, who are equally as important. And that's one of the unfortunate things, that there wasn't enough time. There probably is never enough time for us to say that what needs to be said. But coming to the UK for such an important discussion on Pan-Africanism and reparations, people are bound to want to have their say.
And I guess that this connects directly to the declaration itself, which specifically states, and I will quote, "Acknowledging and increasing the visibility of the essential experiences, knowledge, and leadership of African women in both Pan-African movements and reparations movements."
Yes, that is text that comes from the London Declaration. We do have a section in the London Pan-African Declaration on gender justice and women's leadership, which we felt was important to include. And the reason why we included this section, which acknowledges the need to increase the visibility of the experiences, knowledge, and leadership of African women in both Pan-African movements and reparations movements and frameworks, and to document and amplify women Pan-Africanist contributions that remain underrepresented in public discourse, and to recover and document women's knowledge systems and contributions to Pan-African thought and resistance, to also address how colonial systems deliberately disrupted African gender relations and undermined women's established positions of authority, leadership, and decision-making. And there were others, key points in the declaration. But one of the key things that you've touched on, Brother Simeon, is the erasure of women's intellectual contributions, and the fact that, in my view, this is not incidental. It's a pattern that reproduces colonial gender hierarchies within our own movements. So the declaration explicitly addresses how colonial systems deliberately disrupted African gender relations and undermined women's established positions of authority, leadership, and decision-making power. Yet we continue to see this dynamic playing out in contemporary movement spaces.
Now, I will say that the man has always been and is further humbled. So beyond the gender dynamics, what other tensions emerged around the governance and representation in Pan-African processes?
So one of the tensions that we know is there, and it didn't manifest necessarily in the overt proceedings, but in terms of some of the supplementary discussions, is the role of the government of Togo itself in organising this 9th Pan-African Congress taking place in December. So the Pan-African Declaration that we came up with makes a fundamental distinction between Pan-Africanism as a movement of African people rather than states. So while we welcome state representatives like Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister Professor Xosei, the tension between grassroots Pan-Africanism and state-led processes became evident throughout the organising towards the conference, because this question of which states are truly Pan-Africanist and should states be leading Pan-African congresses, and what has been the history of state involvement in and state actors' involvement in Pan-African movements. The fact of the matter is, most African governments remain constrained by neo-colonial political, economic relationships and international financial institutions, raising critical questions about their ability to authentically advance Pan-African liberation within the constraints of what people like Professor Chinwezu has referred to as Bantustans, these state structures that remain in Africa, the continent of Africa, imposed after the Berlin Conference of 1884-1885, that separate indigenous African ethnicity and nationality from each other. And many of these states being fragile, weak states that are not really able to protect their citizenries and do not recognize that their citizenries border, that their citizenries are not just in that country, that the people that are in that country are connected to peoples that are in neighboring countries and other countries in Africa.
And how did the declaration address the tensions?
Well, for me, it's not so much the declaration. The declaration was just a kind of written version of the process and some of the thought processes that we put out there, and particularly in my opening comments, some of which are featured in the declaration in some way, shape or form, which calls for transforming existing bodies like the African Union and CARICOM, that is existing state bodies, into effective vehicles for the realization of Pan-Africanism by ensuring substantive African representation, which means that it's not just about having skin folk there. It's about having kinfolk, meaning people who are thinking with African minds, who are envisioning realities using African epistemologies and ways of knowing and being and existing or coexisting in the world. It also spoke about the necessity for direct participation of African people, indigenous leadership formations, and grassroots movements. So the problem with many of these states that we have in Africa and the so-called Americas, Abya Yala, including the Caribbean, is that they do not allow for substantive African representation. They are just, based on the Germanic Westphalian model of statehood that promotes allegiance to Eurocentricity or the fatherland, the so-called patria, and that is not really about being truly representative of the various people that make up, that country or that region or that area. And the declaration that we came up with explicitly demands moving beyond state-centered diplomacy to people-centered emancipatory institutions. So it clearly is saying these states are not it. They have to fully decolonize to reflect their people and to truly be representative of their people, and they must empower the people.
Now, that's a super ambitious framework, but how does it address actual implementation challenges?
So while the declaration outlines multiple dimensions of reparations, including material compensation, restitution of our cultural heritage, land reclamation, repatriation or return of our financial assets, our intellectual property recognition, ecological restoration and psychological healing and well-being, we must remain critically aware that declarations are not implementations. The declaration itself emphasizes self-repair, acknowledging that unless we overcome these weaknesses in the spirit and ethos of Pan-Africanism, we will sabotage our people's sacred cause of reparations. So essentially, when it's not yet uhuru, it's not yet freedom for us, we still have to complete the unfinished task of our Pan-African liberation struggles, including complete decolonization.
So does this connect directly to what you were saying about the need for addressing hierarchies within our communities?
Yes. not only our communities but also our movements, okay? And most troubling is the near complete absence of Indigenous African communities in these discussions. So we focus a lot on the need for grassroots representation, even representation of the African diaspora, but we often miss out the fact that our people on the continent are not just organized according to countries. They are still organizing according to their own indigenous communities, ethnicities, nationalities. And the voices of indigenous African people are essential, not as tokens, but as sovereign knowledge holders with distinct relationships to land and questions of holistic justice, holistic reparatory justice. So the declaration attempts to reimagine governance through examples such as Ma'atu Buntuman, the Pan-African Union of Communities that has been championed by the Global African People's Parliament, the Stop the Mangamizi campaign, PARCO, the Pan-African Reparations Coalition, and others. And that more and more people outside of these movements and structures and processes are embracing this idea of a repaired Africa that stops the harms, addresses and arrests the harms of the borders, the structural violences of those borders that were imposed on Africa and African realities after the Berlin Conference of 1884, 1885. So without indigenous African participation, such frameworks of reparations and even Pan-Afrikanism run the risk of reproducing the very same exclusionary processes and practices as the state structures that we are seeking to transcend.
And Auntie Esther, does the declaration itself address the tensions we've discussed regarding philanthropic foundations and their funding?
Yes, actually, incidentally, there is language in the declaration which I don't want to focus on a document, right? Because the document is really a synthesis and a harmonization and an embodiment of some of the best of what our people have been thinking, articulating, advocating and struggling for. But in the London Pan-African Declaration, it specifically calls for implementing participatory approaches at all levels that safeguard against the quote-unquote seduction of movement capture, elite capture and state capture of our reparations cause, and ensuring that the benefits of reparations that we struggle for reach all African people rather than being diverted to a privileged few. These provisions directly challenge funding dynamics that can undermine movement autonomy. And I think this is important language to constantly remind ourselves of. I'd also like our listeners to reflect on how these tensions that we've been talking about between grassroots organising and institutional processes, between women's leadership, the reality of it, its invisibility at times, and patriarchal erasure, including internalized patriarchy that women sometimes exhibit, and how these things manifest in your own context, that is, our listeners. How do we navigate these contradictions while maintaining our commitment to comprehensive liberation and repair? All right, so let's turn now to developments at the Permanent Forum on People of African Descent. While I didn't attend the main Permanent Forum sessions, I was invited to participate as a keynote speaker at an important side event that took place on the 15th of April.
And that was in New York. What was the event about?
So I delivered a brief, and I mean very brief, keynote address titled Beyond Restitution, Ancestral Trust and Reparatory Justice in African Land Relations. And this was a side event organised as the Pan-African Root Synergy Conversation on Land Rights for Indigenous Africans, which was organised by the Kingdom of Kush and the African Union's 6th Region High Council, bringing together representatives from across Africa and her diaspora.
That sounds like a meaningful contribution. What key points did you raise in your presentation?
So my presentation focused on moving beyond conventional Western frameworks of land rights. I emphasised that for Indigenous African communities, land is not merely property. It's the foundation of identity, spirituality, and intergenerational continuity. I introduced the concept of ancestral trust, which recognises that land exists within a living relationship between our ancestors and ancestresses, present communities, and the yet unborn.
And how does that address reparations specifically?
Well, I asserted that colonisation enacted a dual violence, removing us as people from our lands and removing lands from traditional governance systems. Conventional restitution models focus narrowly on physically returning territory or providing financial compensation. But true holistic reparatory justice requires addressing the spiritual severing of ancestral relationships, the disruption of our knowledge systems which are tied to landscapes, and the fragmentation of our governance structures that have maintained ancestral trust.
And were you able to offer practical applications of these concepts?
Yes, I tried to. I outlined how ancestral trust offers practical pathways for implementing reparatory justice in respect of addressing land in our societies and the land question for Indigenous Africans. So some of these pathways include legal recognition of customary tenure based on ancestral relationships rather than documented ownership, restoration of ceremonial relationships with land, the revitalization of our traditional, meaning indigenous governance systems related to land, and documentation and transmission of land-based knowledge. I focused on case studies of coming out of South Africa, Kenya and Barbuda to demonstrate the limitations of conventional approaches to simply land restitution.
And how did this side event connect to the broader forum proceedings?
The side event actually produced a declaration on African indigeneity and land reparations, which I had a role in contributing to. And the declaration was formally presented to the main forum by Sister Dr. Beryl Beekman, who urged the forum to consider land rights as a core issue within its mission on reparatory justice. What's particularly significant is that this declaration explicitly affirms our collective right as Indigenous African people on the continent and people who have retained and recultivated their African indigeneity in the diaspora to reparatory justice as a combined effort.
And with that, what was happening in the main forum regarding reparations?
The fourth session of the Permanent Forum featured calls for collaboration between government, civil society, and regional organisations. According to official news reports, Dr. Hilary Brown, representing CARICOM, emphasised that the Global Reparations Movement is at a defining moment and inflection point marked by a united global Africa finally coming together to speak with one voice. I think it's one voice around calls for reparations or reparatory justice, using that term, but we haven't yet got one voice, and I'm not sure we can, but we can harmonize our voices on approaches to repair or reparations. Equally, Secretary General Antonio Guterres, that is UN Secretary General, emphasized the need for reparatory justice frameworks developed with the inclusive and meaningful participation of affected communities. This is quite a significant statement that came from Secretary General Guterres.
Now, these developments and advances sound promising, but I'm guessing there were still contradictions at play.
Indeed, despite the diplomatic language about inclusion, there remain significant questions about whose voices are truly centred in these processes, and I'm sure that won't be a surprise to hear from our listeners. This is why frameworks like the ancestral trust concept that I presented are so important. They challenge us to think beyond Western legal frameworks and centre Indigenous African ontological understandings in discussions of land rights and reparations.
So would you say the declaration connects to your work with the Stop the Mangamizi campaign?
Absolutely. The Declaration's emphasis on holistic approaches to land justice aligns perfectly with our campaign's push for the All-Party Parliamentary Commission of Inquiry for Truth and Reparatory Justice. Both recognise that true repair requires addressing not just the economic dimensions, but the full spectrum of harm, spiritual, cultural, ecological and political. The side event demonstrated exactly why grassroots organising remains essential even as these conversations reach international forums.
Okay. Interrogating the African Union's theme on justice through reparations. For our final segment, let's crucially examine the African Union's theme for 2025, focusing on justice for Africa and people of African descent through reparations. While this represents a historic evaluation of reparations, discourse is still needed on a continental level so that we can interrogate whose interests are ultimately being pursued and served.
The discourse is not just really to be happening on the continental level, because the theme speaks to justice for Africans and people of African descent, which would include people not only on the continent, but those of us also in the diaspora. So this theme emerged from the Accra 2023 Reparations Conference, and apparently was formally adopted at the 37th Assembly of the African Union in February 2024. The AU has designated this as a flagship program, position it to potentially drive meaningful action. However, we must ask, beyond the powerful rhetoric, who will control the process and define what justice actually means in practice?
Okay, that's a critical distinction. But how do you see this tension playing out in the AU's actual approach?
The AU has appointed Ghana as the continental champion for reparations, which to some degree recognises Ghana's leadership on diaspora connections since its Year of Return initiative. However, as promising as this may seem to some, we must critically examine whether the African Union and its member states, many of which remain deeply embedded in neoliberal economic frameworks imposed by former colonial powers and international financial institutions can truly deliver reparatory justice, or can they truly effect it and secure it for their people? Most concerning is the complete absence, as I have said before, of indigenous African communities in many of these high-level discussions.
So are you saying there's a risk that reparations becomes another diplomacy agenda rather than being fundamentally challenging to power relations?
It's not just a risk, it's the reality that we're already witnessing. The official language speaks of building a common and united front for the cause of justice and payment of reparations, but remains vague on implementation mechanisms. When reparations is framed primarily through diplomatic language, it shifts from a justice framework to a negotiation framework. This allows former and arguably contemporary colonial powers to reposition themselves as dialoguing partners rather than perpetrators obligated to make repair. And crucially, indigenous communities who should be at the centre of these discussions from a continental standpoint are systematically excluded, their sovereignty ignored in favour of state-centred approaches that fundamentally cannot deliver genuine reparatory justice. Case in point, the Over Herero and Nama people who are being excluded from the bilateral negotiations between the government of Namibia and the government of Germany.
But how does this relate to collaboration between continental and diaspora reparations movements?
So while the theme explicitly mentions bringing together the African citizenry and the African diaspora, we must ask, who controls these collaborative spaces? The African Union CARICOM Joint Reparations Task Force, for instance, I believe it's called, or I'm not sure if it's a commission, primarily operates through state representatives rather than through direct community participation. This creates a disconnect between diplomatic efforts and grassroots movements.
Okay, but the AU says that it's establishing a global reparations fund. What are your thoughts about that?
This proposal reveals another contradiction. While creating mechanism for financial flows outside conventional aid structures is necessary, we must examine whether these flows challenge or reinforce existing economic hierarchies. So who will determine and control the fund priorities? Which communities are going to benefit whenever it gets established? Who will control the disbursement and for what initiatives and programs? Are these going to be truly reparative relationships or simply creating new forms of capital flow that will preserve existing inequalities and hierarchies? The African Union documents speak of operationalization, but remain silent on governance structures that would ensure community control, especially of our indigenous African communities, and the substantive African representation that is required, including us as the sixth region of Africa, the so-called diaspora.
Okay, but these probes, to me, seem to connect directly to our discussion about movement capture and elite interests. So how are African governments positioning themselves in relation to these contradictions?
Let's be completely clear here. AU member states are fundamentally compromised in this process, like most states, including those in the Caribbean. They seek reparations from former colonial powers while simultaneously facilitating contemporary forms of resource extraction and land grabbing that dispossesses indigenous African communities. They speak of justice while actively limiting democratic or communocratic participation within their own borders, which actually they are incapable of doing, it would seem. They invoke Pan-African language of solidarity in rhetoric while maintaining these same structurally violent colonial borders, restrictive visa regimes, and hierarchies that marginalize indigenous knowledge systems and governance structures.
Now, given this stark reality, how should grassroots organizations and movements within reparations engage with these continental initiatives?
We must remain fiercely independent and community-centred. It's not just about declarations or diplomatic performances. It's about implementation and the actual redistribution of power. Indigenous communities must be brought into these dialogues, not as tokens, but as the sovereign nations that they are, including recognition of their own knowledge frameworks, their own epistemologies of repair and justice. We need to build horizontal relationships between continental African and African diaspora communities that completely bypass state mediations. The state framework, whether it be the African Union or CARICOM or other national governments, cannot deliver reparatory justice because these institutions themselves are products of and participants in, to varying degrees, the very colonial structures that we're fighting against. To me, they are not radical or transformative enough. They are not sufficiently decolonized to be able to hold and steward our people's intergenerational sacred cause of reparations.
So, what would you say to listeners who might feel encouraged by the AU finally centering reparations, but also cautious about the contradictions you raise?
These tensions aren't reason for despair, but for clarity. You know, this notion of we must, as iron, sharpen iron. So by recognizing these contradictions, we can navigate them more effectively. Yes, the AU's adoption of this theme creates important political space, but liberation will not come from the top down. I encourage listeners to examine reparations initiatives in their own context, asking who ultimately is benefiting, who is controlling resources, and whether they challenge or accommodate existing power structures. This critical analysis can only strengthen rather than weaken our movements. As we bring this episode to a close, I'm struck by the common threads running through all of these developments that we've been talking about today, from the honouring of women in reparations movements to the African Union's theme of the year.
Yes. We're seeing a maturation of reparation discourse that moves beyond making the case for why reparations are justified over to developing specific mechanisms for how reparations can be implemented.
And crucially, these developments reflect the protection strategies we discussed in our previous episode: building autonomous capacity, ensuring community accountability mechanisms, developing independent resources, and really forging power in such a way that we can secure the restitution of resources that we require to organize, as well as maintaining movement integrity while engaging critically with institutional processes.
Yeah, and I'm particularly encouraged by how these various initiatives connect local, national, regional, and international efforts. Effective reparations work happens at all levels simultaneously.
Yes, Before we close, I'd like to invite listeners to continue engaging with these ideas, with these processes that we have been highlighting in this discussion.
And we're particularly interested in hearing about reparations initiatives in your local communities. The grassroots efforts are the foundation upon which all these larger developments rest.
Exactly. As we've emphasized throughout this podcast series, Yɛresiesie Yɛn, preparation for reparations requires both personal and collective work.
Yes, thank you to all our listeners for joining us today. We look forward to continuing these vital discussions in our next episode.
Until then, stay engaged, stay committed, stay vigilant, and remember that the work of repair begins and must be led by us. This is Esther Xosei,
Simeon Stanford,
on behalf of the Maangamizi Educational Trust, reminding you that when we protect our movements from capture and neutralization, we are practicing Yɛresiesie Yɛn. We are preparing ourselves for the justice that our communities deserve. Thank you also to Brother Daniel Kofi, our technical assistant, for all of your support today.